This lesson will be about an amazing story, how a lifeless rock turned into a rock teeming with life. Of course, Earth is our home, but the human species is just one of millions that currently inhabit this planet. Now, in the mid-1800s, Charles Darwin introduces a powerful way to understand the history of life on Earth, and that is the tree of life. Now, why does the tree of life have so many branches? Well, we've learned that there are many ways to make a living on Earth, so natural selection will tend to multiply species over time. Now, this is a picture of a poster, actually, that illustrates the tree of life. The tips of the tree are currently existing species. So, for example, we've got some mammals up here, and as we go down a branch, we're moving back in time, back towards extinct ancestors. And so the branching nature of the tree means that species multiply from common ancestors. Now let's take a look at some of the major branches. In green, we have the plants. Here we have fungi here. And then the whole rest of this part of the diagram would be animals. In fact, it's color-coded here, so the purple would be the invertebrates, creatures without backbones, and then we got the blue starting here. We got the blue, we got the vertebrates, we got fish, and then the yellow, we got some amphibians here, and reptiles also in the yellow. Some of those reptiles evolved into dinosaurs, which went extinct, and some of them, although one of the dinosaurs that made it through the extinction were the ancestors of birds, so the birds are up here in pink. We've got the mammals in orange. Now, the tree here is sort of biased to show more animals than other kinds of organisms. Now, Darwin's claim, of course, then, is that any two currently living species have a common ancestor at some point in the past. So, for example, if we take a whale, a mammal here, and any kind of bird, they will have a common ancestor. You just go down the bird branch, go down the mammal branch, and where they converge would be the common ancestor, in this case, a primitive reptile. In fact, you can just say any animal and any plant will have a common ancestor. So we just go down the plant branch, down the animal branch until they converge. It just so happens that the common ancestor of plants and animals is a single-celled organism, of course, which looks neither like a plant or an animal. And at the very base of the tree, the root of the tree, will be the origin of life itself. Darwin also speculated about the origin of life. You'll recall that when several species share a trait, Darwin's going to consider the possibility that they inherited the shared trait from a common ancestor in the past. Well, since all living things are composed of cells, Darwin inferred that the first living thing, too, was a simple cell, perhaps assembled in a warm little pond long ago. Now, how does one study the origin of life? Well, it's helpful to consider the conditions on Earth when life might have arisen. We're talking about nearly 4 billion years ago, and what scientists think happened was that life emerged from geochemistry. That is, chemistry on the early Earth produced important molecules that later assembled into the first living cells. So this suggests a research strategy. Try to simulate the conditions of the early Earth, and then you want to study the kinds of molecules produced by different chemical processes. In 1952, Stanley Miller did just that, and he's going to open up a whole new field of research into the origin of life. He's going to try to simulate the early Earth with this apparatus here. He's got a chamber here. He puts water in it to simulate the oceans. Apply a little heat and you'll get evaporation like you find on the Earth. He's got another chamber here where he will introduce various gases that he thought were present in the atmosphere. Gases like nitrogen, hydrogen, methane, ammonia, and then the water vapor. He'll introduce a spark here to simulate lightning, and he hopes that some interesting chemistry will be going on here. Whatever new molecules produced will be collected down in this fluid here. Now, the fluid initially, the water, was clear. After a couple days, the water kind of turned brown, and he analyzed the chemicals found in that water, and he found very interesting molecules, amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, and lots of other organic compounds. These are molecules that have carbon in them. So these are lots of the kinds of molecules you find inside cells. Now, he did not create a living cell, but he did manage to synthesize many of the molecules found inside cells. And this excited lots of people at the time. And so a whole new branch of science was, in a sense, created by Miller and his colleagues, those interested in studying the origin of life. Now, there were some criticisms. Later, NASA scientists identified the atmospheric gases on planets like Mars and Venus. Now, Earth likely had a similar atmosphere early on. And based on what they discovered, Miller's mixture was not realistic. He got the gas mixture wrong here. When you use more realistic gases, you don't get as much of the interesting chemistry. You don't get as many of the amino acids and other organic compounds. In addition, molecules would have drifted away from each other in such a vast solution as the ocean. See, the idea here is if this chemistry is going on in the atmosphere and then the interesting new chemicals are raining down into the ocean is huge. How could those molecules be concentrated enough to then assemble into the first living cells? So there were some major criticisms of this early result. So the search continued. Are there places on Earth where chemistry might occur and concentrate the resulting organic molecules? Well, in the 70s, some really interesting rocky structures were found at the bottom of the oceans. They're called hydrothermal vents, and this one is an alkaline hydrothermal vent. Now, these hydrothermal vents are regions of volcanic activity on the ocean floor. And the vent has a constant supply of energy and simple molecules from the Earth's interior. And in addition, importantly, there are very small chambers throughout the vent capable of concentrating organic molecules so that further chemistry can happen. In fact, the minerals in the rocky walls of the compartments speed up chemical reactions. So it began to look like these vents were a really interesting place where chemistry might have been going on in the early Earth. Was it a possible solution to some of the problems with Miller's approach? So here we see sort of a diagram of one of these vents. We've got these rocky compartments that are magnified here. So this is the magnification of one of the compartments. We've got simple atoms, simple molecules coming up from the Earth's interior that are going to be entering these chambers here. We've got the walls of the rocky compartments have certain minerals that can facilitate chemistry going on here. So we're calling this geochemistry. We've got a source of energy and raw materials percolating up through these rocky chambers. We've got a situation where whatever molecules produced by chemistry are going to be concentrated by these small little chambers. Perhaps really interesting chemistry went on here on the early Earth. Now, many questions remain about the origin of the first cells from that chemistry going on. Cells are very complicated structures. They have a membrane and they have a metabolic engine consisting of a whole team of proteins that can break down food or extract energy from the environment. You've got the genetic material, whether it's DNA or RNA, that codes for the recipes, right, to build the proteins. So it's a very complicated interacting sort of little machine. So there are lots of questions about how these first cells arose. Here are two key questions. How were the key molecules synthesized? So again, just what exactly were the chemical processes that produced the molecules that make up proteins or DNA and sugars and lipids that make the membrane, etc. And then another really interesting question, how did the genetic code emerge? How was it that a certain sequence of DNA or RNA specified a certain one of the amino acids that make up proteins? How did that code originate? So lots of work needs to be done in this field, but it's an exciting area of research. And if you're just sort of wondering, how could such a complicated thing as a cell arise from just chemistry? Well, remember, we're talking about huge lengths of time. 200 million years of chemistry all over the vents on the bottom of the ocean might just produce some complicated things that we call cells. So one of the leading contenders in origin of life studies is the undersea hydrothermal vent origin for life. The idea is that primitive cells escaped their rocky nurseries. For a couple 100 million years, fascinating chemistry was going on here, such that important complex molecules started to assemble into the first cell-like structures that then left their nursery to wander out into the vastness of the oceans. So here we have the basics of a primitive type of cell. It's got a membrane boundary. It's got a metabolic engine, proteins doing the chemistry of life, and then we've got some kind of the computer genetic material. Now there's a question of whether it was DNA to begin with or RNA, but some kind of genetic material that has the recipes for building the proteins that are doing the chemistry of life. Now once you get a primitive cell like this, and you get some kind of genetic material, DNA for example, or RNA before that, then the DNA would be the key to life on Earth, because it can store the information necessary to build the cell's proteins. It can be duplicated for the purposes of reproduction, and when DNA is copied, sometimes there are mutations, so it can change. And of course, that change feature of the DNA allows for a species change and multiplication over time. So when we think about the origin of life, then it's an amazing story. The first living cells would have then given rise to all life on Earth. So we're going to call this LUCA, the last universal common ancestor. It was a primitive cell. Now, on this tree here, you see two of the branches are types of bacteria, and then this other branch has all the more familiar organisms. So the idea is LUCA would have been kind of similar to a very primitive kind of bacteria, you might say. In our other tree, we see all of these brown ones down here are different kinds of bacteria. In fact, there are two kinds of bacteria. There's bacteria and then the archaea group. But LUCA evolved into lots of different early bacteria. And this means that the study of bacteria can shed light on the origin of life, because the first cells quickly gave rise to lots of different kinds of bacteria. So why study bacteria then, to study the origin of life? Well, bacteria are the smallest and simplest cells on Earth. They have no nucleus, no mitochondria, and the first cells to emerge on Earth would likely be the simplest kinds of cells. Bacteria show the most diverse biochemistry, as though they have been around for a long time, evolving new biochemical adaptations for a variety of environments. And bacteria can live in extreme environments, which is consistent with their ancestors evolving in extreme environments on the early Earth. So notice then, some people approach the origin of life by studying bacteria, specifically those bacteria that live in extreme environments, sort of simulating the conditions on early Earth. So it's another way to study the origin of life, is to study current bacteria that live in extreme environments. And so, with the emergence of LUCA nearly 4 billion years ago, the great tree of life on Earth began. And because cells can reproduce with heredity and sometimes mutations introduce new cell traits, the first cells could evolve into ever more complex life forms. So it's amazing to contemplate that with just some random mutations, natural selection, and heredity, plus 4 billion years, bacteria did some amazing things. They evolved into all living things on Earth.